varies the whole way down. I have a cold, but I will do my best to articulate. I would also like to start with a quote by the main protagonist of my paper, Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who in one of her innumerable issues of the so-called Pearls of Wisdom pamphlets that she issued weekly with her pronouncements, says the following: "Our negative interactions with one another throughout this life and our past lives have caused karmic debris to accumulate around our chakras. The buildup of misqualified energy around our chakras can blunt the effectiveness of our prayers. If our chakras are clogged, the light of Ein Sof we invoke in our prayers will become tainted as it flows through us. As the light passes through, it then takes on our negatives. This is why it's so important to clear our chakras and the passageways that connect them before we invoke the names of God. The violet flame creates an action of transmutation. To transmute is to alter in form, appearance, or nature, especially to change something into a higher form. The violet flame can literally consume the debris around our chakras. Using the violet flame is like soaking your chakras in a chemical solution that dissolves, layer by layer, the negative karmic substance that has been trapped there for perhaps thousands of years. When we diligently invoke it through heartfelt prayer, the violet flame consumes the gross elements of our native karma and activates the subtle spiritual part of us that is native to our soul. When properly applied, the violet flame clears the channels of the chakras, so there is a pure flow of Ein Sof's energy through the Sefirot to our physical and spiritual bodies." End of quote. The purpose of my paper is to unpack this and very many other quotes that I will not present to you here, but that do the same kind of theosophical appropriation of, among very many other things, the Kabbalah. And I will do this in 3 parts. First, a very short theoretical framework that largely links up with what Carl told us in this paper about welcoming structures. Thank you. Second, very briefly, the history of Elizabeth Clare Prophet and the movement that she headed, the so-called Summit Lighthouse movement. And third, a short overview of how precisely the Kabbalah is integrated into this structure that you can hear is composed of so many other elements. So first to the theoretical part, which I will try to keep short and simple. As many of you will be aware of, Gordon Melton, in his great and very useful encyclopedias of new religious movements, groups religious movements in families which have to do with their shared historical roots. He does so rather impressionistically and perhaps just as a way to structure an enormous amount of data. But it's my contention that there is a way to formalize this, and that not only the contents of various doctrinal and ritual systems, but also their specific ways of relating to, appropriating, or rejecting other religions fall into these family patterns. And in order to look at this, I'm in particular inspired by the work of 2 anthropologists, Gail Bauman and Andre Gingrich, who in their Grammars of Identity and Alterity from 1999 suggest that there are basically not that very many ways in which religions can come to grips with the existence of very other religious systems. And to reduce an ethnographically very complex work to just a few headlines, they distinguish between, firstly, the simple strategic takeover of parts of another religion. For example, your ritual seems to work, we'll just start using it. The second one, dualism, which comes in 2 flavors. Our religion is good, yours is awful. Or the other way around, our religion is stale and old, yours is much more interesting. And the third, which they have borrowed from Indulgence Louis Dumont and his pupils, and which they call encompassment, which basically says that your religion is fine enough, it's just a somewhat more primitive subset of the one that I'm practicing. Through my higher understanding, I can tell you what your tradition is really about. All of us sitting here know, of course, that Theosophy and its many offshoots particularly rely on the strategy of encompassment, and that is the way by which they managed to incorporate Hinduism, Buddhism, Christian mysticism, Kabbalah, you name it. So how then is this done? Well, here I rely on my second maître à penser, Gilles Fauconnier and Mark Turner, cognitive scientists, who in their book Conceptual Blending from 2002 suggest that existing conceptual structures are used to make certain aspects of the materials, the inputs that we meet, particularly salient. In this conceptual blending, the tension between what we can call on the first hand the source structures, the source both in the sense of the sources one reads or the sources one hears, but also the sources that one appropriates. The tension between the source structures and the target structure, the new revelation or the new dispensation, that tension is resolved. Very occasionally, this is done by simply freeing one's fantasy completely from the sources. And there are forms of, should we call them post-theosophical movements, that have an absolutely anarchistic and free relationship to the sources that they purportedly draw on. Max Freedom Long spent a few years in Hawaii, and in a revelatory moment realized that the Hawaiians, behind their Polynesian traditions, in fact had a hidden kind of wisdom, which, surprisingly enough, incorporated such elements as reincarnation and the subtle bodies of the human being. It's just that the Hawaiians had coded this information. But by reverse engineering the Hawaiian language and constructing spurious etymologies based on various Hawaiian terms, Long was able to, in quotes, reconstruct Hawaiian ancient wisdom, or why not Hawaiian theosophy. And that it is in fact Hawaiian theosophy is testified to by the fact that his main disciple, Serge Kahili King, publishes his books with Theosophical publishing houses in the US. Most other forms of post-theosophical appropriation, including the one that is the main topic of my paper, are done by a much more subtle balancing of the source structures and the target structures. Because studies on human condition have produced very robust results to show that counter-arguments to our beliefs are not ignored, but are actively used to reinforce the views that we already hold. And unfortunately, the time is too short. I would have loved to tell you of some of that research, but we'll have to skip that, and you will have to just accept on my authority at this moment that this is in fact the case. So much for the theory, a very simple framework which I hope to expand in the paper version, the printed version of my presentation. Now then on to Act Number 2, the historic background for Elizabeth Clare Prophet and the movement that she headed for a number of years. It all starts, at least in the American context that interests me here, with a person called Guy Ballard, born in 1878, an avid reader of occult literature in the first decades of the 1900s, and who post hoc presented himself as the recipient of a mystical experience on Mount Shasta in California, a place that had been renowned for encounters with mysterious beings. Mr. Ballard decided to go hiking on the mountain, and on one day in 1930 encounters a person of exceptional beauty who offers him a drink of the clearest water he has ever seen or tasted. And this august being then reveals himself to be the ascended master, Saint Germain, one of a pantheon of masters who has the particular role of guarding over the destiny of the United States of America. So much for Ballard's self-presentation. Because nothing with this message, if he ever has had this encounter, until 1934, when he begins to publicly proclaim that he is in fact a messenger for the ascended master, Saint Germain. Now we have heard in panels yesterday and today that Theosophy never had an American nationalist agenda, but I beg to differ on this account, because this particular revelation that Saint Germain guarded the destiny of the United States, was influential in making Ballard a much more interesting Theosophical spokesperson than any of the members of the Theosophical societies around in the States at this moment. In fact, Ballard's message was presented in what you could call Theosophical megachurch environments, in auditoriums with place for up to 6,000 people at the time. And although there really was never a membership, this was more an audience cult, where one could send for materials for self-study, one could go to lectures, so there are no membership figures, but the little research that has been done on Ballard and his movement tend to show that it was in fact quite large and quite influential. Finally, Ballard died, or as he and his disciples would have said, ascended in 1939 at Grand Teton Mountain in Wyoming, a site that would gain mythical importance for several of his followers. For followers, indeed, he had. Perhaps typical for a movement that is not very strictly regimented and that functions as an audience cult, independent entrepreneurs could simply go on and say, well, I'm also a channel for Ascended Master Saint Germain, or any other of the gradually growing pantheon of this class of movements, some of which include the Bridge to Freedom, founded in 1951, the Summit Lighthouse, which is at the center of my attention, 1958, Temple of the Presence, 1995, the Heart Center, 2005, and many, many others beside, a kind of American post-theosophical cultic milieu, if you wish. The Summit Lighthouse, 1958, was founded by Mark L. Prophet, a man who was raised in the Pentecostal milieu, which I find interesting enough, considering that, well, you know that Pentecostalism encourages speaking in tongues and so forth. He then joined several other occult or post-theosophical movements until he, in 1958, founded his own, the Summit Lighthouse. Shortly after, he met a woman by the name of Elizabeth Clare Wolfe, divorced his then wife, and married Elizabeth Clare in 1963, who afterwards obviously then also carried the last name of Prophet. And Elizabeth Clare Prophet was then trained to begin channeling herself, which she did in 1964. And when Mark L. Prophet died in 1973, or ascended, Elizabeth then took over the movement and assumed leadership. And Mark Prophet then simply had a form of post-mortem charisma by being not only ascended, but being then declared as a semi-divine being, who had previously held the position of high priest in the Temple of the Logos in Atlantis. He had previously reincarnated as Noah, as Akhenaton, as Origen, and many, many others, and have now changed his name and should be known as the Ascended Master Lanello. Elizabeth Clare Prophet was by every account a charismatic leader, and was called such honorary titles as Guru Ma, or Mother of the Flame, by her followers. In the first many years of her teachings, she was, quite integrated into the cultic milieu of those days. That is, we'll come to her teachings in a moment, but there was nothing very extraordinary about them. They would be instantly recognizable for anybody accustomed to theosophical messages. Posters of her were, for example, prominently placed in my hometown of Lund, together with Maharishi of Transcendental Meditation and other figures well known in the sort of secretive circles where I also was frequenting at the time. But all of this changed in 1986, when at Thanksgiving she declared that she had received an announcement from Saint Germain that there will be a nuclear attack from the Soviet Union on 23 April 1990. And the nationalistic language and agenda was then raised to completely new levels. Of course, as with every apocalyptic movement that we have seen so far, the date passed, nothing happened, and after this apocalyptic non-event, a lot of people left the movement. And again, since membership figures were never disclosed, it's very hard to tell, but the few scholars who looked at the movement, Bradley Witzel in particular, who's written a book about it, suggests that approximately 1/3 of the membership simply disappeared. In 1999, Elizabeth Clare Crawford was diagnosed with progressed Alzheimer's disease. She showed herself publicly for the last time in 2000, and after that was confined to her home until she died in 2009. And after her Alzheimer, and after the apocalyptic non-event, and even more after her death, the radical dualism of the late 1980s with America is good, the Soviet Union is bad, we will soon be attacked by nuclear weapons, all of that disappears entirely, not only from what one can see of her teachings from those last years, but also in what is disseminated by the movement. Because the board of directors took over, and it's quite clear that what they want to do is to reintegrate the Summit Lighthouse into this kind of cult milieu or New Age milieu to make the message more appealing again. And our focus here will, of course, then not be on the apocalyptic events or that part of the Summit Lighthouse history, but on what came before and after, namely the attempts to incorporate and appropriate a number of different traditions, and Kabbalah in particular. And that is what I'm going to spend the last part of this paper on doing. Now, having heard my quote, one would say, well, this is an obviously theosophical or post-theosophical movement, but I would like to try to at least formalize it a little bit and say that there are some elements that are so typical of a whole family of movements that they can be characterized as post-theosophical. There are specific conceptions of the superhuman dimension, that is, a much lesser emphasis on the divine than on various semi-divine intermediate beings, to use the phrase that you had in your paper. There are specific ideas about the afterlife, that is, of reincarnation, not in any Hindu or Buddhist sense, but in the kind of progressive amelioration that one finds in also the New Age. There are fairly specific ideas about an occult history with events happening on continents that ordinary historians normally cannot recognize, such as Lemuria and Atlantis. There are ideas about the human constitution, usually with one or several occult bodies visible only to the clairvoyant. There are ideas about our true identity, as for example sparks of the divine that are only temporarily clothed in material garb, and that will ultimately, after some process of self-improvement or ascension, reintegrate with the spiritual domain. And there are typical ideas about other religions that we've heard in practically all the papers here, namely the idea that there is a vast ocean of universal wisdom, to quote our Theosophical friends that we met on the first day, a vast ocean of universal wisdom that can be tapped into, and that ultimately behind the uninteresting exoteric details will show itself to be identical all over the world. Now, how does one reconcile the source structures, that is a Jewish Kabbalah that comes in many versions, is very complex, has a particular set of technical terminologies, a vast literature that is hard to master, and so forth and so on, with the target structure, universal wisdom? How does one do that? Well, as I said at the outset, cognitive science shows that it's not done by necessarily ignoring the evidence, but it is by knowing about some of the evidence, but actively reinterpreting it. That is, for instance, how Blavatsky seems to have done it. She published, for example, in 1888, issue of the Theosophist, a short summary of what she had read in a book on Kabbalah by Christian Ginsburg. The book Kabbalah is Doctrine, is Development, and Literature, a loyal summary of what Ginsburg writes. But then afterwards, when she uses it, for example, in The Secret Doctrine, she comes with the kinds of claims that we've heard here before, that Kabbalah is actually of Aryan origin, that Kabbalah is in fact completely congruent with, quote, esoteric Buddhism, unquote, and so forth. And the same goes for the next generation of Theosophists. Leadbeater was not an ignoramus. He can write such passages as the following, which was sort of a decent potted summary of what Kabbalistic literature is about. He says it consists of certain great texts written in Hebrew and Aramaic. He mentions the Sefer Yetzirah, he mentions the Zohar, he mentions Baron Knorr von Rosenroth's translations, he mentions Reuchlin, and so forth and so on. And then immediately afterwards writes, like all such literature, this contains priceless gems of occult wisdom hidden in a mass of rubbish. So basically, you have the materials in front of you, but since you know that some of it is rubbish, you can cherry pick what you want to. And not only that, Leadbeater refers to Arthur Edward Waite and credits him with the idea that besides the written sources, there was an oral transmission known only to a spiritual elite. So not only is it possible to subtract from the mass of literature to retain what you want to, you can also add to it and claim that this comes from a different strand of tradition, a different kind of revelation, or an oral transmission that he, Leadbeater, happens to know. So then finally, how does Elizabeth Clare Prophet use Kabbalah in this kind of reinterpreting mode of reading the texts? Well, just like Blavatsky and Leadbeater before her, she is no ignoramus either. She does refer to a mass of different texts and sources. She refers to well-known Kabbalah scholars. She has footnotes and references in various issues of Pearls of Wisdom and in the books to Sholem, to Moshe Idel. She refers to English translations of the Zohar, the Sefer Yetzirah. She quotes English translations of books by Cordovero, by Gikatila. She quotes various modern practitioners, the kind that more sort of classically oriented Kabbalah scholars, such as Joseph Down, would have said, oh, this is not Kabbalah, this is New Age garbage. But she quotes them on the same level as these more classical sources, and uses these sources to claim or to advance a number of particular claims about what Kabbalah is really about, claims that I assume very few, so let's say more traditionally minded Jewish Kabbalists would actually even recognize. First of all, the first of these claims is that Christianity is a largely superseded religion. How in the world can one use the Kabbalah to arrive at this idea? Well, she uses a Christianized Kabbalah and says that the Sephirah of Tiferet is in fact the same as Christ. Something that to the best of my knowledge is found in Pico de la Mirandola for the first time, but which she does not attribute to anybody. This is just something that she has received in a communication from one of the ascended masters. But this is the way it is. Tiferet was a symbol of Jesus. But Jesus was not the Son of God in the usual Christian sense, but only in the sense that we all potentially are. And because all the Sephirot are to be found in our body, Tiferet is also found in our body, which proves that Jesus is in fact an aspect of our own divine selves. And in fact, she explains that the external Jesus, the one we know historically, the one that Tiferet originally was, he was relevant for the astrological age of Pisces, an age that activated the archetype of Jesus as a son. But we are now at the dawn of the age of Aquarius, and only now can we overcome or transcend this limited external manifestation of Tiferet and find our own Christhood by living out this Sephirah in our own lives. So that's the first thing. Jesus was only relevant for the age of Pisces. Number two, Kabbalah reveals that the divinity is also feminine. It's part of Summit Lighthouse doctrines that God is both a he and a she. And Elizabeth Clare Prophet refers, in fact, to Kabbalistic ideas about the Shekinah and so forth, but claims that this feminine aspect of the divinity is not only essentially the same, but is absolutely the same as all other manifestations of a divine feminine. So the Shekinah is identical to the Chinese Kuan Yin, which is identical with the Virgin Mary, which is identical with various mother goddesses of Hellenistic antiquity, and is in fact identical with what she calls the eternal womb with capital E, capital W, which is the same as the material world that we live in. Quote, "She, the eternal womb, has borne you since you came forth from the great central sun, clothed in the garments of the sun." So Kabbalah points back at this universal truth, that we live in a feminine universe because the divine is feminine. The third thing that she advances is that all our relationship between ourselves and this absolute divine truth goes via the Sephirot. This has been revealed, quote, both by the Kabbalists and by the Ascended Masters. And the Masters have explained exactly how this works out. And the ensuing doctrines that flowed forth from the pen of Elizabeth Clare Prophet are complex in the extreme. And since I have very little time left, I will just very basically tell you that the idea is the following. We have 3 higher bodies, and we have 4 lower bodies. The Sephirot are located in one of the higher bodies, the so-called Causal Body. The Causal Body to the clairvoyant looks like a set of concentric circles, and each of these circles is associated with one of the Sephirot. And the clairvoyant can look at this causal body and observe how these Sephirot, in what state they are, and determine a whole lot of things about one's personality and about one's spiritual state. But the Sephirot are also located in one of the lower bodies. In the etheric body, the 7 chakras are also located, and each chakra is associated with one or two Sephirot, or 2 Sephirot, depending on how many is needed to make these not entirely equal numbers correspond to each other. So Theta corresponds to the crown chakra, Chokhmah and Binah correspond to the 3rd eye chakra, and so on through the whole list. Furthermore, Kabbalistic writings describe the mystical ascent of the soul, and according to Elizabeth Clare Prophet, this is identical to the ascension as described by the Ascended Masters. That is, that if we prepare through many lifetimes and unclog our chakras and get rid of karmic debris, we can come to the point that enough karmic debris, to be precise, at least 51% of it, she's very precise in that, one will, after physical death, ascend to one of the most exalted destinations, the so-called etheric retreats, where the Ascended Masters live. This is the ultimate purpose of life, and is the same as the Kabbalistic tikkun, according to Elizabeth Clare Prophet. Finally, she also takes over this idea that man, or human, was created androgynous, and only after the fact separated into male and female. And she suggests that this is the same as the teachings we received from the Ascended Masters, that we are all born with a so-called twin flame, a soulmate of the opposite gender, living somewhere in the world unknown to us. But again, if we clear enough of our karmic debris, we will meet our opposite gendered soulmate and become complete again in yet another take on the idea of fall and regeneration. So to conclude, we recognize in this an utterly theosophical message, remodeled to some extent by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, and buttressed by arguments taken from a variety of different religions. I could have taken Buddhism or Christianity and made the same kind of presentation, but since Kabbalah and appropriations of Kabbalah are the topic here, this is the way she goes about it. She reads the sources, she reads the scholars, but she cherry picks and she adds where necessary to actually be able to say that the Kabbalists, in their own way, said exactly the same thing that my Ascended Masters say to me today. Thank you.
All right, if you don't mind, I'm going to take the chair's privilege here and ask the first question. Because I only figured this out as you were speaking, but I took her daughter out to dinner last month.
Oh.
Which one?
Which one? Aaron?
Aaron, yes. And I hadn't even thought of Prophet in terms of a theosophical context, because in the States she's thought of, she's discussed solely in new religious movements, and Aaron herself calls her mother's movement a cult, right? And Erin's a graduate student at Rice, a PhD student, and she's my age, so she was fully aware of, during her adult life, of what was going on in her mom's compound. Right, 2,000 people lived there. You had to give mom your money and no one was allowed to have sex, but mom had sex with many different people whom she then subsequently kicked out or advanced in hierarchy. So there's a real clear sociological new religious movement to this that looks, more like Waco or early Mormons than any theosophical bunch of people sitting around just thinking about Kabbalah. So I'm just wondering how you would think of a sort of institutionalized, rule-bound, really sort of hardcore theosophy in these terms.
Well, I think any worldview can basically be encapsulated in any kind of organizational frame, and theosophy hasn't been a cultic milieu with everybody thinking what they want to throughout its existence. And we have less regimented but similar cases. It does remind me a bit of anthroposophy in the way that Helmut describes it, with a core that tries to keep its teachings intact, and a lot of independent people around who don't accept this dogmatism. This conference is not about social structures or organizations or apocalypticism, and that's why my presentation comes across as a bit sanitized, because it's about worldviews. But the other part of it is, of course, also there. And since it was explicitly mentioned that theosophy had no nationalistic ambitions in the US, I decided just to briefly mention the fact that we do have ultra-nationalistic and madly nationalistic versions of theosophical teachings, where the ascended masters tell people that the US has a special divine role in human history, like in Balaar. Saint Germain comes with numerous messages channeled down to his recipients, telling them that the US has a leading role in world history and is uniquely graced by destiny. A kind of theosophical civil religion plus apocalypticism all mixed into a quite particular thing.
Massimo?
Yeah.
No, Massimo first.
Yes, my comment is more sociological than historical, but it's in the same line. I declined to participate happily in the famous Jim Lewis study, but I went twice to interview Elizabeth Clare Prophet, once alone and once with Gordon Melton separately from the study. And the second time the movement was already collapsing. She was not in good shape, but still able to speak. And I think that the sociology of the post-theosophical movements is that continuously there is somebody who tries to create in this fluid theosophical cultic milieu a rigid organization. And it's very rare that they succeed. They may succeed for a while, and then the movement collapses again in this fluid and of the cultic milieu going on. When Mark Prophet created the movement, he didn't start out of the blue, because there are a couple of important characters, Geraldine Innocent and Francis Ike, who were there before. And when Prophet, particularly after he married Elizabeth, they really did it, creating a rigid structure, and now it collapsed again. And so some people are rediscovering Geraldine Innocent as really the source of most of the stuff Elizabeth Clare Prophet allegedly channeled. But even these new organizations are very disorganized. And I think that's the good reason to have at least one paper about these post-theosophical groups in this conference, because it shows that, to me, it is theosophy, because the doctrine is, of course, theosophical, but it shows that it's quite difficult to take from theosophy such a kind of rigid structure, and normally they don't last. And they last for a while, and then they collapse in the milieu or the sub-milieu. There is perhaps a I-am sub-milieu in US, derived from the larger Theosophical milieu. And so now I think after Elizabeth first got very sick and then died, the Church Universal and Triumph is very small, and most of the followers have been reabsorbed in this larger Theosophical I-am milieu. So, question, is it possible to derive from Theosophy rigid, somebody would say cultic structures? Yes. Do they last? Normally not.
It's an astute observation, and it's, as you know, it's the same for practically all families of religions. I mean, even Scientology, which is one of the most strongly regimented religions, has produced the free zone with independent operators trying to use Hubbard's so-called technology without being organizationally affiliated. So even for Scientology, it's been very hard to keep those rigid boundaries, especially by being pelted by on the internet and in the media by people who say that, well, Scientology is a dangerous cult and Ron Hubbard was crazy and all these things. And the same goes for ISKCON, that had its problems and so forth. So I think it's just a case of it is very difficult in the present day and age to have a strongly regimented religious organization because the infrastructure really isn't there. In the olden days, when you had a near monopoly of, let's say, one state church or whatever, they could police the boundaries much more strongly. But with so many different versions of spiritual truths and so many possibilities of just leaving the organization, continuing to channel or audit or whatever you want to do, it's very, very hard to have a religious organization of that kind.
So next,
Yeah, thank you very much. I learned a lot in your second and third part, but I want to ask back to your first part, because I think it's very important to reflect about this methodological and strategic aspect of how appropriation works. And in the case of Kabbalah, this seems to be especially important because actually Kabbalah could get nearly everything. Mathematics, physics, occultism, language theory, poetology, whatever. So this is thing that obviously belongs to Kabbalah, to the structure of Kabbalah that is extremely adaptable and transformable. So take this, I wonder whether your differentiation between source and target orientation isn't a little bit too static. You could probably try to look more at what happens in between those two, let's say, poles of a process, to dynamize this more, to think it more in a dynamical way, meaning you used also the term, namely transformation. And I think there is one concept that could be extremely helpful for that, and that is Bloomberg's notion of work on myth and Arbeit am Mythos. His notion of work on myth excludes the existence of the Arche and of the Telos, just these two poles that you name as a starting point in asking what is the source. I mean, as philologists and historians, we have to ask after the sources. We have to ask what are the sources, but the source is something extremely relevant, extremely relative, and as soon as you start to look upon the sources, they fall apart. It's nothing stable, with other words, following Bloomberg. And the same goes for, let's say, the telos, the target. And that's why he claims for looking at history of, in that case, mythology, of myths as a permanent rewriting process, permanent process of transformation. And I think this could be very helpful to see it in a more dynamic way, the whole history of, in our example, reception of Kabbalah.
Yeah, I think maybe there's just a linguistic thing here. I don't mean, of course, source in any way, the beginning and target as the end, but simply the point of departure and of a particular process and where one arrives. And I would like to give the simplest imaginable example, because all of us here have experienced it. And that was when Carl explained where the chakras sort of entered into theosophy, and the theosophists at the end of the room said, but the chakras are just part of truth. So you have the source, historical information, and the target, dehistoricizing it, and it probably took like an instant. And they had immediately disregarded the historical aspect as uninteresting or false or irrelevant. And if we had interviewed them, I'm sure we would have found out if it was false and uninteresting or irrelevant. So it's a cognitive mechanism more than anything else, and it can be observed in 1,000 situations.
All right, we started 5 minutes late, so we can go 5 minutes over. Marco, and then Helmut.
Yeah, very briefly, I just wanted to get back to the issue of nationalism, because I think there has been some confusion here in the discussions we had. It all started with the problem of identitarian discourse, and there was, of course, your reaction to it with respect to the situation in the United States. I think the problem is on the fact that one thing is what happens in certain European countries where the references to the past, for obvious reasons, but identitarian discourse can be based also on other things. It's not necessarily an ancient tradition that is precisely located in one particular region. And as Massimo showed, it can be also, for instance, the physical aspect of a place, a landscape, and so on. And it can be other things. I think that some aspects of an identitarian discourse precisely targeting the United States or based on the United States, you find also in William Quinn Judge, which came to my mind afterwards, when there was a schism with Annie Besant, rereading some of the passages of what he was writing there and why the leadership should go to an American. Well, might be interesting also with respect to that. So maybe it goes even further back than Ballard and the I.M. movement. So it's just that the identitarian discourse is not necessarily related to a particular, let's say, primordial tradition located in a space. So that's.
And I look first from, I can't speak for that, but for myself, my thinking stops at 1910. If it's later than that, you know, it would never occur to me to think of something in the 1980s.
Just to add the word, and also in the case of America, it would be interesting always to keep in mind the role, the imaginative role of natives, Native Americans, which I think is also important for spiritualism. Because you said, for instance, Benjamin Franklin is the only one that appears in this kind of communications, but very often you have Native Americans. So.
But it's not patriotic. It's hideously racist and embarrassing. It's not patriotic.
No, it's not patriotic, but, you know, it's part of a discourse that relates to the identity of, you know, of a place.
So. Last question.
I would like to come back to the first part of your contribution, which Andreas already mentioned. I think you give us the chance again to reflect on how we interpret theosophy in terms of conceptualizing an institution. I'm not very sure whether Bauman's grammar of identities might help us, because it's either a binary or hierarchical system or concept to organize religious communities. And I fear it's part of the Jewish-Christian history of drawing boundaries. When we discussed yesterday evening the question of theosophical movement and theosophical society, or if we stick to concepts like hybridization or entanglement or these things, we get another access to theosophical, no, how do you call it? Societies, institutions, movements, whatever. And I would plea for revising our sociological tools to analyze theosophy. There are indeed forms which are institutionalized like a classical association or society, but there are other forms which really don't fit in this matrix. And what's happening in the 20th century, or at the end of the 20th century, seems to me a new form of finding a social construction to organize that what we call theosophy or post-theosophy. So I feel we are always in our minds the formula of an institution with closed boundaries, with ways to become a member or not, and all these osmotic possibilities. They are a bit far away from us. So I think you gave us an example to reflect on a new perspective of an interpretation of theosophy in terms of social perspective.
Okay, I think that more is a comment than as a question.
Yeah, indeed.
Nothing really to add.
I think we should take it as a compliment. All right, thank you very much, everybody.